Hello, everybody, and welcome here to Cloud Builder Live. My name is David Tucker, and I'm really glad that you've joined me. And I'm especially glad for those of you that are joining that are Azure developers, because we had our first two episodes of Cloud Builder Live. They were focused on AWS, but now we're going to spend not just this episode, but I'll go ahead and give you a heads up. Even the next episode we do of Cloud Builder Live, it's going to be entirely focused on Azure. And if you're joining for the first time, I just want to give you a little bit of insight in terms of what this series is all about. And really at the core of it, it's really all about helping you build real solutions in the cloud instead of just knowing about cloud services. So for you, that might mean that you've gained a certification, but you're really trying to figure out how to build things the right way in the cloud. And listen, if that's you, you are in the exact right place, because that's what we're going to be covering here on Cloud Builder Live. Now, we're going to be diving into two, not just one, but two services that are in preview on Azure. And I think these are services that you need to know about, because I think anytime you have a major service announcement, it helps you understand a little bit about the direction that that cloud platform is going in. And we're going to be looking primarily at Azure Container Apps. Now, I know what you might be saying at this point. Why do we need another container service? And trust me, I totally get it. For those of you that maybe haven't actually sat down and written this out by hand, let's take a little bit to do just a little bit of a journey to help understand what different container services are available on Azure. So, if we start off here, we can look at having just initially, we're going to have app service, because, hey, we can run containers on app service and it can do it pretty well. It can handle a lot of different use cases. We also have Azure Container Instances, more commonly known as ACI, which is a Hyper-V based orchestrator for dealing with containerized applications. And it can handle a pretty good scale in a lot of different use cases. There's also the Kubernetes service, or AKS, which is the managed service that's provided by Azure for dealing with Kubernetes. And let me just stop here, because this is going to be a part of what we'll talk about today. And that is that Kubernetes right now is the standard for how you run containerized applications on the web. So everybody's saying, hey, I want to do something in that realm, but there's still a lot of boilerplate you have to get through, and there's a lot of knowledge you have to have before you can be successful on Kubernetes. But that's not it. We're not done yet. We also have Azure Functions, which can run containers, and we have Azure Spring Cloud, which can run containers, and Azure Red Hat OpenShift. So with all of these different options, what really do we gain with Azure Container Apps? We see that Kubernetes is kind of the standard. And so for a lot of people, they've said, well, I'm just gonna gain the knowledge I need. I'm gonna go out and learn how to build things on Kubernetes, if that's the right solution for what I'm building. And I totally understand that mindset. But like I said, sometimes we can gain a little bit of insight into cloud platforms and the choices they make and the directions they're going based on services that they release. So Microsoft saw this problem, and at Ignite, back at basically the middle of November, they announced a new service called Azure Container Apps. And let's just dive in for just a minute and try to understand what this is. So Azure Container Apps enables you to leverage many of the capabilities of Kubernetes without having to perform much of the boilerplate config and maintenance. So this would almost be like if you said, for example, hey, wouldn't it be great if I just figured out a standard way to build and deploy my Kubernetes applications? I picked a couple of open source libraries that are really important and really essential, and I'm going to use those, and we'll just standardize how we're going to work with it within our organization. Well, that's kind of what Microsoft did with Azure Container Apps, and it really fits several different use cases. So I just want to run down these use cases for Azure Container Apps so you understand what it's a good fit for, and also maybe what it's not a good fit for. So let's take a quick look as we go through these. So the first use case that we're really focused on here is going to be public API endpoints. Now, they have made no qualms about the fact that they're really focusing on microservices and public API endpoints with this. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Also, background processing. So if you need to run background processing based on maybe items that are in, service bus or other queues, things like that. That's a good way to do it. Also here, that event-driven processing. So if you're doing things that are more real-time fed off of a queue, you can look at that. And also microservices, as I mentioned earlier, using Dapper. And that really brings me to the next point here that I think is very important for you to know. And that is that there is a lot of Kubernetes support built into Azure Container Apps. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, Azure Container Apps is Kubernetes. It's just they've taken out the ability for you to access the low-level configuration. But that doesn't mean that you're missing everything that Kubernetes provides. So we have support for Dapper. We also have support for Envoy, for scaling triggers with Kata, which is Kubernetes event-driven auto-scaling, and things like traffic splitting. Okay, now this is where I need to put up the big warning slide. So here's the warning slide. We're going to be looking at two different services, Azure Container Apps and Azure Load Testing today. Here's what you need to know. They are both in preview. Don't use them in production yet. Please, not yet. It's really valuable, I believe, to learn how to leverage these services within your organization, because you're going to be the one they go to once these services actually get to be generally available. So there's a ton of value in learning them early, but things will change. I even had to file a bug yesterday while I was getting ready for this session today because there was an error in one of the generated GitHub workflows, which we'll look at that later. So things are still adjusting and tweaking as we go through it, but I think both of these services, you will benefit from knowing how these services work. So I see a comment there. Somebody says they're moving all their critical workloads to Azure. Don't make me stay up all night and worry that you're going to put stuff into production on this. So, okay, we're good to go. So now we've kind of gone through some of the beginning parts here. Let's talk a little bit about prerequisites, because again, the goal here is that once you watch this, you're going to be able to go back. You're going to get access to all the code I have. You're going to be able to see me go through it. And I want you to be able to do this yourself. So with that being said, let me go ahead and switch over here, and I want to just go ahead and review these prerequisites with you. So first of all, you're going to need to have an Azure subscription. I realize for some people that might go without saying, but I just want to call this out here. It's going to be valuable for you to have an Azure subscription. You're also going to need to have Node.js. Now, with this example, I chose to just make it as simple as possible. And for me, that meant building this in Node.js. And again, we're not talking a lot about the code today. That's really not the focus. It's more how we deploy this and how we access it. So with all of that being said, we're going to use Node.js, and there's just really going to be a single file of code, and that's all we're going to deal with. You will need to have Docker. You'll also need to have the Azure CLI. And then this next one you don't have to have, but I think it's useful, and that is the Thunder client extension for VS Code. Now, if you have something like Postman, you can use that too. But I've actually included files within the repository for Thunder client. And to be honest, I've kind of switched over a lot of my stuff away from Postman, just a personal preference issue. So with all that said, we're going to switch over here, and I'm going to pull up the browser. And here within the browser, you're going to see the repository that I'm going to be working from today. Now, there's really not a ton here because, again, the point is not necessarily the code that's here, but you can see a few key things. We have a Docker file. We've got an index.js file. That's where all of the logic for the microservice we're going to be deploying is. And because this is Node.js, we've got a package and a package lock file. And we also have a file here called tests. Now, this is not unit tests. We have a JMeter script here that you'll see that we'll use later when we get to load testing. And then we have two different files for the Thunder client, which we'll get to just a bit later. So that's really all we've got. Now, there are two branches here, so you can actually go to the end state as well. Really, all that's going to do is that's going to show you what the GitHub workflow looks like that Azure generates, and that's also going to have one other method inside of the index.js file. But we'll get to all that, so just hang with me on that. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and fork this repository, and I'm going to have this be one that's actually going to just be present under my personal account. So we're creating it here. So perfect, it's going to be creating this. Now that I've got my own personal fork of this, I'm now going to jump over to the terminal. And here within the terminal, I need to go ahead and do a few things. First, I'm going to go ahead and clone this repository. Perfect, we've got that done. So now we're going to actually change into that directory. And now from here, we're gonna go ahead and run npm install. Now I need to call out something here. We're actually using some data from a group called Our World and Data. So I'm gonna go ahead and jump over while it downloads this real quick. I'm gonna jump back over here to the browser. And here you'll be able to see the actual repository that I'm pulling this data from Our World and Data. Now this is open, that you can access this. I have included in the README file all the information about the contributors for this data set, and you can go in and read a lot more about the work that they do. But what this is this is actually the real data used to analyze COVID patterns around the world, and the data is present in most countries since the beginning of the pandemic. So we're going to develop a microservice just like we were planning to make this out to be something that could power different visual applications, but we're just going to deploy the microservice itself. And we're going to use specifically the JSON file. Now you can see this. I'm going to go ahead and go back over to the terminal. We can see that this is finished downloading. I'm going to go ahead and open this up in VS Code. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this down to where you can see it. And if you notice here in my package.json file, we have in the post-install step, we're actually downloading this JSON data file, and you actually can see it here. I would click on it and open it up, but it is 110 megabytes. So I'm not trying to freak out VS Code at the moment. It would open it, but it would just take a little bit. But you can see that that's how it actually gets downloaded in the installation process. Now, as I mentioned, our index.js file is fairly basic. We have some different APIs that we can actually go through and access. And to make it easier, instead of just sitting here walking through everything, this is where I mentioned that we're going to use a Thunder client. But before we do, I'm going to go back here, and I'm actually going to just say npm run start, and we're going to be able to actually run this locally, which is going to be on port 8080. So let me go ahead and pull back up VS Code. I'm going to go here under Thunder Client. And what I'm going to do here is I've actually already have configured this COVID API test collection and an environment. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and just delete this environment for the moment because I want to show you how you can pull this in yourself. You can just go here and we can say that we want to import. And if I look here in this particular folder, you can see that I have both an environment and a collection. So that's how you can import these from the files that are included with the repository. Now that I've got that here, what I can do is just take a look at this environment. I'm actually using 3 different environment variables: hostname, protocol, and port. So that's already saved in there. The next thing I need to do, I could pull in my collection the same way, but in this case, I just need to be sure that it's going to be connected with the correct environment. You would need to do this as well after you import them. And then I'm just going to hit save. And now what we can do is I can actually close these windows. And now I can go here under COVID API test, and I can say, I want to run all. And then I can hit run. Now what you'll notice is that 3 of the 4 of these succeed. So we have, for example, one here that says get all countries. Now, if I click into this, you can see that this is just going to return some JSON for each of the different countries that are in the data set. Perfect. And if I look here, we have another one that says get data for country on date. This is where we can actually go in and get the number of, for example, cases and deaths related to COVID for a specific day. In this case, we're pulling in March 30th of 2020 in the United States, but that's just one example here. So you can see here that we have 3 different calls. One's not working, and the reason it's not working is because we actually are going to add this later with the continuous deployment in GitHub. So that's what I want to show you that we're going to implement, as well as getting this deployed instead of just running this locally, running this on Azure Container Apps. That's going to be our goal of what we're doing. Okay. So now that I've kind of gone through all the prerequisites and we've walked through what we're actually deploying, and we've actually run it and we see that it works locally, now is the point where we need to go through and start the process of getting ready to run this within Azure Container Apps. But I want to talk to you for just a second, because one of the choices that you have when you're working with Azure Container Apps is you get to choose what registry you're going to use for your container images. Now, traditionally, if we go back to the beginning of registries like this, Docker Hub was where everything would go. We also have the Azure Container Registry, and this is what we're actually going to use because this integrates very well with the continuous deployment that you can use with Azure Container Apps. It's just easier to configure for you. Now, I personally have started using the GitHub Packages container repository for a lot of my personal projects. And that's another option that you can consider. You'll just have to write some of that logic yourself within the GitHub workflow, as opposed to relying on Azure to create that workflow file for you. So again, up to you. You do what you want, as long as it is compliant with Docker in terms of how it acts as a container registry. You can pretty much use whatever you want. It's just going to be easier if you're using Azure Container Registry, and that's why we're going to be doing it. So with that being said, what we're going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and open up the portal. And so this will be our first jump into Azure here. So here I've got the portal opened up. Now, you might not have done anything yet with Azure Container Registry. Totally fine. We're going to go through this and do this together. So I'm going to go ahead and create a container registry. And it's going to take me through the process, just like anything you'd make in Azure. So I'm going to go ahead and say that I want to set this to a resource group called Pluralsight. I'm going to go ahead and do a name here. Now, in this case, I'm going to use the name Cloud Builder Live, probably not surprising to anybody. And I'm going to change the location here to Canada Central. Now, part of the reason for that, I could leave it exactly as it was, but part of the reason for that is Container Apps is a preview service, as I mentioned earlier, and it's not available in every region yet because of that. We're actually going to be using Container Apps out of Canada Central, so I'm just going to keep my container registry there too. Also here, I'm not going to select availability zones, and we'll keep this as a standard SKU. We don't need some of the advanced features with this. As a matter of fact, we don't need anything past this screen. So I'm just going to hit review and create. Great, validation passed. We'll hit create, and it's going to initialize this. Okay, now, as this goes, we're going to go ahead and let it finish, and then we're going to need to do one additional step before we're ready to start using this particular container registry. So it's done. We're going to go here to the resource. Now, what we need to do here is go under access keys, and here where it says admin user, we're going to go ahead and switch this to enabled. It's currently disabled. This is what will enable us to access this from the CLI, and we can actually go through the process of deploying our container image here. Now, if I were to do this right now, you all would actually see the different keys that are generated. So by the magic of the internet, I am going to actually just move this off the screen for just a second. I am going to enable this. Perfect. And then I'm going to go ahead and go back, and then I'll move this back onto the screen, and it's just like nothing ever happened. See, magic. Okay. Now, we have our container registry in place, and we're able to use it. So now we're going to go ahead and go back over here to the command line. Now, we don't need this running locally anymore, so I'm going to cancel that. The next thing that I'm going to do here is that I need to log in to the Azure Container Registry. Now, you can use just normal Docker login if you've ever worked with the Docker CLI. You could certainly do it with that. In this case, though, I'm going to choose to use the Azure CLI for this. And so we can simply just say Azure AZ ACR login, and then we need to give it the name. In this case, the name of our registry, if you remember, is Cloud Builder Live. So that's what we want. And it'll take it just a second to go through the process of logging in. And we're logged in, and it tells us login succeeded. Perfect. Now, the next thing we need to do is that we need to actually tell it to build. And yet again, instead of using the Docker CLI, I'm going to use a command that is built into the Azure CLI. And in this case, I'm going to do it that way and actually tell it the Git repository to go find this in, and it will handle everything else for me for this initial build of the container. Now, we're not going to be doing this every time because we are going to integrate with GitHub for continuous deployment in a bit. Okay, so that's what we're planning to do here. Now, you also might end up wanting to just use Docker locally if you're dealing with a private Git repository. So in this case, because I'm using a public one, shouldn't have any problems with this. So let me go ahead and bounce back into this. So let's go ahead and move to the next step here. That's not what I wanted. I went too far ahead in my script here. There we go. So here we're going to run AZ ACR build. We're going to give this, the image is going to be called COVID API with a latest tag. We're going to tell it the registry to use, And then from a platform perspective, we're going to say, okay, with Linux, we want you to build this particular Git repository, and there will be a Docker file in there. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and this will take a little bit of time. It's going to go ahead and start the process of pulling this code down and starting to actually build it and push it out to the Azure Container Registry. Now, one of the great things is when we have stuff that takes a little bit of time, this will give me time to answer any questions. If anybody has any questions that they've actually had so far through what we've covered up to this point. So I'll try to watch the questions here and see if there's anything I need to jump onto. Also will allow me to take a sip of coffee. And yes, for those of you that are doing the math, it is almost 6:30 here on the East Coast of the United States, and yes, I'm still drinking coffee. Okay, awesome. I don't see any questions just yet, but I will try to keep my eye on that. And if there are any questions that pop up, if it makes sense to kind of pause and just deal with those directly, we'll do that. Okay. Hey, I agree, Evil Maverick. It is never a wrong time for coffee. I think you and I would see eye to eye on that one. That's for sure. So this is now going through the process, and I'll go ahead and pull it back up so you can see it. It's still being pushed, and now we've reached the end. Perfect. So this is kind of what we wanted to do, was get it up and running. Now we're ready, since we have this pushed out to ACR, we're now ready to actually go back to the portal and create our first Azure Container App. Clap, cheer, yell, all that stuff. It's exciting. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We are going to go to Container Apps. Now, you'll see I don't have anything currently configured. Now, before we get into the specifics, it's going to ask us something, and this is something that's going to require you to have a little bit more understanding of how things are structured within Container Apps. So let me go ahead and shift back over here to slides for just a second. And so here, if I pull this up, we have the structure of how a container app works. So first of all, we have an environment. Now the documentation talks about this environment as a boundary, both for the application itself, but also for things like logging and observability. So that all exists within an environment, but you aren't limited to just having one container app inside of an environment. You can actually have multiple. So here we can have two, for example. Also, inside of each app, we have revisions. So you can have not just one, but you can have multiple revisions going at a point in time. As I mentioned earlier, that Container Apps supports traffic splitting. So you could do, green, blue, green deployments. You could do, A/B testing, those kinds of things. Also, you'll notice here, revisions technically can have multiple containers. Now we're just going to be doing a very basic single container deployment. We're also only going to have one revision active at a time, because this is just, getting things up and running. There's a lot more advanced use cases that you could dive into with this. But here you could, as I mentioned, you could have, a revision. You could also have another revision for an app and another revision for another app. But all of this exists inside of an environment. So with that being said, let's go ahead and shift back over to the browser, and let's go ahead and start walking through this process of creating our first container app. So I'm going to go ahead and hit create. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and set my resource group here to be Pluralsight, and I need to give my container app a name. So we're just going to call this COVID API, since we're serving out COVID data. And here, where it says container app environment, we're going to select create new. So here we need to give this a name. Now I'm going to say COVID API prod. Now let me explain. Here, in a lot of ways, it makes sense for you to have an isolation for each environment of an application inside of a container app environment. So for example, if our COVID API, let's say we had a staging environment, well, we would have a separate staging environment or container app environment for staging, and then one for production. So that's kind of how I'm structuring it here. I'm also going to use Canada Central, as mentioned earlier. So we'll just click create, and that's going to allow us to finish the process of setting this up. Now, we have the option here to use a quick start image. We are not doing that. We are jumping straight to a custom container. Yay, that's exciting. And here, I'm going to call this COVID API. And as I mentioned earlier, that it's easier when you're using Azure Container Registry. So because of this, I can just go in and actually select my registry, select my image, and I can select the tag, and that's all I have to do. I don't have to remember anything. I don't have to copy stuff down. It just works. The next thing here is I'm going to bump up just a little bit this CPU in memory. And then in addition here, we need to talk about ingress. So you can configure your containers to work in several different ways. One is you can completely limit HTTP ingress. In this case, I'm going to enable it, but now I have the option to say whether or not I just want this to be within the Container Apps environment. Why would you do that? Well, you would do that if you're deploying multiple microservices that you want to connect with Dapper, and there might be a container app that you don't want to have any other access other than from other microservices within that environment. So that would be great. You also could limit it to a specific VNet, but in this case, we're going to say we want to accept traffic from anywhere. And then it's going to want to know the port, which in our case is going to be 8080. Great. Now we can go through and select tags. We don't really have any, so we can go ahead and go to review and create. It passed validation, so now I'm going to hit create. Now, it's going to go through the process of deploying. Now, while this deployment is happening, there's another conversation that we need to have, okay? So let me go ahead and go back to slides for just a minute. Here's what we didn't have to do, that if we were managing Kubernetes ourselves, we would have to do. So first of all, create and configure the cluster. Also create a deployment manifest, deal with certificates, and then also manage the cluster over the life of the app. These are all things because we're choosing to build our application with this service that has a very opinionated way of how we build them. So we don't have as much configuration, but we have a lot less maintenance and theoretically a lot less headaches. Now, if you have an application that maybe has some just crazy scaling requirements that don't fit into the typical here, or if you're looking at something that's going to need, hundreds of instances, and if you're going to, scale very rapidly, there might be situations where, you're going to want the configuration that you can get with Kubernetes. So you're going to want to leverage AKS. But I've got to be honest, half the clients that I've worked with that have pushed into Kubernetes, like a service like this would have been completely fine with what they're looking to do. Now, another thing to note here is that this is a serverless service. You don't have to manage those instances. And also, here's the great thing. This can actually scale down to 0, depending on how you have your Azure Container App configured. So if you're not using it and you just want it to scale to 0 and you have the minimum instances set at 0, then there's a lot of time you just might not be paying anything to have this up and running. But the moment you go through and you trigger it again, or you make a request again, then it can actually spin up accordingly. And we'll take a look later at how it handles scaling in general. So that's what we didn't have to do. So let me go ahead and let's go back here to the portal. We should see this almost done. We're getting pretty close here at this point. So it's going to go ahead and it's created all the kind of ancillary items, and it's working on the actual container app itself right now. So we will wait for this to finish up. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go and then rerun our tests with the new host name inside of VS Code and the Thunder client. And that will let us know if this is actually working. So, okay, let's give it just a second here. Everything goes slower when you're doing a demo. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. While we're waiting, just for fun, and hey, it's done, but I would love to hear just really quick in the comments if any of you have just a quick, crazy demo story of something that happened when you were doing a live demo. I always find those super hilarious. I could share several myself. Feel free to drop those in if you want. Okay, so our deployment is complete. So I'm going to go to the resource. So here we can see we have our container app. Now this gives us, an HTTPS URL. So certificates have already been configured. Things like a load balancer have already been configured, right? And it's ready to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy this and we're going to go back to VS Code. I'm going to go here under Thunder Client. I'm going to go under my environment and we're going to go ahead and update this. I'm going to change the protocol to HTTPS, which means we're going to be looking at port 443. And we're going to change here the host from localhost. We're going to change this to the new host name that we have. And I'm just going to take off the protocol and stuff at the beginning. Great. So now that we have that in place, I'm going to save the environment and I'm going to go back here to my collection. We're going to go here to COVID API test. We're going to go to run all and we will run. And we can see here, it is working great. It is doing everything that we needed it to do. We still have one that's not working, but again, as I mentioned earlier, that is on purpose. So you can go ahead and assume we'll fix that in just a minute, because we will. But we have deployed a container-based application on Kubernetes. It is up and running. It is secure. Certificates have been configured. It also will scale for us. We'll see that in just a bit. And we're up and running with, to be honest, very little boilerplate configuration and work. And here's the great thing. We haven't even touched yet the different configuration capabilities that we have for changing things like how it scales, to what extent it scales, how it could communicate with other container apps, how it can work within the environment. So really, in a lot of ways, we have just scratched the surface of what's possible with Azure Container Apps. Okay, so now that we've gone through that entire part, we're now going to go through what I think is one of the great features of this, is how easy it is to start the process of setting up continuous deployment with GitHub and Azure Container Apps. So let's go ahead and head back over to the portal. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to look here under the blade on the left, and we're going to go to continuous deployment. Now, I need to go ahead and tell you that I've already set up a connection between this particular Azure subscription and my GitHub account. It will guide you through that process. You can do that yourself, but I've already done that here. That's why it can go in and see things like, what repositories I have and the like. So I'm going to go ahead and say this is going to be my personal one. This repository is going to be, we'll go here under CBL. And CBL April 2022, that stands for Cloud Builder Live, for those of you keeping track at home. And we're going to use the start branch. That's where we want to work from. So we're good to go on that front. It already has the information about Azure or our ACR, and it's got all the information about that. Next, it's going to need something called service principal settings. So let's talk about this for just a minute. So with this, we are going to have the ability to trigger things to happen from our GitHub workflow. This includes updating our container image inside of the registry, and it includes updating our container app with the new container after it builds. So with that being said, what we need to do is we need to create a service principal that's going to give us the capability to do that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the terminal. Now, here's what you need to enter. So we're going to go ahead and type this in. Now, this is something else I'm going to do off screen in just a second, but here we're going to also use the CLI, and here we go. I'm going to pull it up so you can see it. We're going to use the CLI here to say that we're going to create a service principal for role-based access control. I'm going to call this COVID app, and the role is going to be contributor. And here with the scope, I'm going to specify my subscription. And you'll notice here there's a little portion that is in that we have in some braces here, and you'll notice that it's actually saying subscription ID. You need to replace this with your actual subscription ID for this to work. And so once we have this in place, it's going to return several values, and we'll use those values to fill out this particular form. Now, as I mentioned, I'm actually going to go off screen here for just a minute. I've actually got the correct values here for my subscription, and I'm going to go ahead and enter those in. And so what I'm going to do is now I'm going to enter these values in. So one of the things that it specifies is a client ID. So great. We're going to put that in there. We are also, and you guys can see that, and then we're going to have a secret, which again is a, wait for it, secret. So you won't be able to see that. So I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. And the next thing that we need to pass is the service tenant ID. So I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste that in as well. So now, once I have all of these things in place, I'm going to go ahead and say start continuous deployment. Okay, so what it's going to do here is it's going to actually connect to my GitHub repository. It's going to enter in some secret values into my GitHub repository for me. On the branch that I specified, which is start, it's going to create a GitHub workflow that will build the container and deploy the update to container apps for me. That's what it's doing right now. So it's going through the process of setting this up and configuring it. Okay, so perfect. we actually see that is now done. So let me go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and show you the screen here, and we're going to go back to the repository. Now I'm going to go ahead and reload this. And one of the things you're going to notice is that we now have a GitHub workflow in place. So if I click on this, we'll actually be able to see what it's doing. First, it's going to go through and actually go through a build step, and this is what's actually going to build and push our new container image into the Azure Container Registry. Then the other thing that we have here is that we're going to then deploy, it's going to use the CLI, so it's going to go in and log into the CLI, and then it's going to run this inline script that will deploy this out and update to container apps. So that's perfect. So let's go back to VS Code. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back. We need to actually go here and pull so we can get those updates. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we want to pull, and it's going to pull down those changes. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go under this workflow, and I'm going to eliminate this paths declaration. If you want to know why, you can go look at the README file. There's a slight bug with that. And so I've included a link to the issue there if you want to follow that process. But here we now have this configured so that it works with our start branch. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'll give you guys a heads up. I'm about to have a little bit of a time here where I'm going to answer some questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and throw it out there. And while this actually builds, when we actually push a change out, I'll go through and try to answer those questions. Perfect. So that's one thing we needed to do here. The next thing we need to do is I'm going to go ahead and add in this missing method here under our microservice. So here, this is going to be the one that's missing. This is what we're going to use to pull back if we want to get all of the base data about a country. We can actually do that with this new one that I've added in. So now we have these two changes. So I'm going to add these in. I'm just going to say updating microservice. Perfect. And we'll go ahead and say, great, that's what we want. We'll say that we're going to sync changes. And now I'm going to go back and open up the browser. And we'll go back up here to the top. We're going to go under Actions, and we can see that it is already running our workflow. It's going through the build process now, and then it's getting ready to go through the deployment process. So I see here the question, and let me go ahead and pull this up full screen so you can see my face. So I see a question here. Is it container instance, not Kubernetes as AKS, right? So to answer this question, this actually is not Azure Container Instances. This isn't ACI. This actually is Kubernetes that is running this behind the scenes. And this is one of the key selling points of container apps, is that you're able to leverage some of these open source libraries, again, as I mentioned earlier, like Dapper, like dealing with any of the scaling triggers for Kata, like Envoy, and some of the core features of Kubernetes that are exposed through this. Now, I'm just giving you a very basic introduction, but this is, again, it goes quite a bit deeper than what I'm going to show you. For example, there's a lot of use cases here around deploying, let's say we deploy 10 or 20 different microservices within a single environment, and then configuring the ability for them to communicate one with another using mutual, TLS communication and authentication between them, so that you can securely communicate between microservices, have some microservices that are exposed to incoming HTTP requests, some that aren't, to even, again, do traffic splitting between different microservices. All of those things are possible utilizing container apps. So again, there's quite a bit of power in this service. And again, I think, it's showing that Microsoft is acknowledging that a lot is going into the Kubernetes community. Now, again, you guys, if you followed me at all on Twitter or other places, you know that I don't think in most cases, I don't think that in most places you actually will see me, say, hey, Kubernetes is the first thing you need to go to. A lot of times there's a lot of other services that will work quite a bit better. But in this case, that's, what, if it's a perfect fit for what you're doing, then, hey, this is a great service to take a look at and to figure out if this is going to work for your workload. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to actually go to see how our workflow is doing. So I'm going to click over here. We'll see that it actually just finished with deployment. Now, the way that we'll know that this deployed correctly is if we actually have is if we actually have our tests run correctly. So I'm going to go back here to Thunder Client, and I'm going to go through and run this again. I'm not going to do any other changes, and we should be able to see now that, yes, everything has completed. So just by making that one change, what we've been able to see is that we've been able to deploy this, and actually by deploying this, we're able to get that deployed out to container apps and through our container registry without any issues. So that's what gets us from point A to point B. And if we could continue to push, we would continue to see those things update as long as it's on the branch that we specified. Now, I want to kind of take this to the next level. I want to show you some things about scaling here. So we're going to go take a look at another new service that is in preview called Azure Load Testing. So I'm going to keep this open. I'm actually just going to duplicate this tab, and I'm going to go ahead and go here and search for load testing. And I mentioned I included a JMeter file inside of the testing directory. And what we're going to do is we're going to set up a new test here. Now, I already have configured a resource for Azure Load Testing because this takes some time to create. And I'll note here that when you create this, for most of you, you will not have access to use it. You actually have to go in and give yourselves permission to access this. But once you configure that, you can do whatever test that you want, because they actually want to make load testing something that you basically have to be added into to have permissions to do. It's not something you have permissions by default. So here for tests, I'm going to go ahead and create a new test. We're going to go ahead and I'm going to just keep the default name, and I'm going to say, no, I don't want to run it right after creation just yet. Next, we're going to create a test plan. So I'm going to go select that JMeter file that I mentioned earlier. So this, I'm going to go ahead and give me 1 second here. I'll pull this down on the screen. If you notice here under tests, we have testplan.jmx. I'm going to grab that. We're going to upload that. Great, that's completed. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is enter in parameters. Now, it actually uses the exact same parameters that we use for Thunder Client. So I'm going to specify host name, I'm going to specify port, and I'm going to specify protocol. And I'm going to go ahead and enter in the correct values for that. So we know that our port is going to be 443. We know protocol is going to be HTTPS. And here I just need to get the host name. So I'm going to go back under the other tab. We'll go back to the overview here. And once it actually pulls this up, I'm going to go ahead and copy this value, and we will paste it in. Great. And I'm going to go ahead and remove the protocol here at the beginning. Next, we're going to go to load. I'm going to specify here that we will just use 2 instances for this test. And now I need to specify test criteria. Now, I want this to error, to not have any errors whatsoever. So we're going to say that the fail condition is if the error percentage is greater than 0. Now from here, we can just specify review and create. The validation has passed. I'm going to go ahead and hit create. Now, the reason I want to do this is I want to actually show you how this scales with these requests. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to specify here a command in the terminal that we'll actually be able to use to watch our replica count for our specific container app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back here to the terminal, and I'm going to go ahead and move this back to where you can see it. And I'm going to go ahead and run this really long and obtuse command. Basically, all I'm doing is I'm pulling down the information for the number of replicas for our container app. And what I need to do is then just pull that value out, and we're going to watch it over time. Now, the one thing I have to do, though, to make this work is I need to go get the name of our replica. So let me go ahead and pull that back up. And that's why I kept this open. If we go under revision management, here we can see the name for this particular revision. I said name for replica a second ago. I meant to say name for revision. And I'm going to go ahead and pull this back up here in the terminal, and we're going to paste it in. Now, right now, when I run this, what we're going to see is that this is at 1 because we ran this recently. But again, we just us calling it, there's been 1 or actually 4 requests in this case. So it hasn't had a scaling event. But when we go back here to Azure Load Testing, I'm going to tell it now to actually run this script. And over the course of about 15 seconds, what's going to happen is that it's going to throw 6,000 requests at our API. Now you can see here it's accepted this. Next, it's going to be provisioning. So it's going to get those instances ready. And what we want to see next is we actually want to get to the point where it's running, and then we're going to switch back over and we're going to see how this number actually changes over time. So let's give this just a second to finish creating. And I'm looking over here at questions. So can I enter these programmatically? Yes, you can. You can actually, you can create these in the way that you would prefer. So if you want to go in and create these with the CLI, you can certainly do that. Again, Azure load testing is a preview service. So when you pull this up on the CLI, you're going to have to add in a new extension. So with that, let me go ahead and see if we've moved yet into provisioning. Okay, our test is done. So if I go back and I look in the terminal, we can see here that this number has increased now to 3. And if we watch this, we can now see that it's gone up to 8. And it probably will stop there. Maybe it'll go up to 10. We'll see. But that's gone through pretty quick. I see your comment there, Brad. But yes, you can configure this. Here's the one thing I would say as well. One of the cool things is I could, and I hadn't planned on talking about this, but I could actually add a step. Let's say that we had configured this error condition. We say, hey, it has to be 0. And also we can even specify that the average load time or the average response time needs to be a certain amount. I could put that in my GitHub workflow and actually have that test and have that condition be a condition before it actually updates the container app. So here's how that would work, right? You would have a separate staging environment. You could deploy the update at that point. You could then run the load test. You also could obviously run any unit tests or other things that you have. And if it doesn't meet that criteria, then it wouldn't move on to the next step, which is actually pushing it out into the production environment. So there's a lot you can do following this same process. And there's actually notes in the documentation on how you add in Azure load testing into your GitHub workflows. So there's quite a bit there as well. But if I go into this, you also can see a ton of data around here. I can see again, 6,000 total requests in 11 seconds. The average response time was 603 milliseconds, and that's made possible because we're just reading data out of a JSON file that's entirely in memory. We're not calling any databases or anything like that. But we can see here that our error percentage is 0%, so it actually meets the criteria and it passed. But again, the main reason that I showed this was I wanted to show you that you can, without even going in and doing a ton of configuration, this is going to scale out of the box for you based on the number of HTTP requests that you have. And it's going to work fairly well because, again, it actually held up to 6,000 requests, and that was a huge change in just 11 seconds. And even with that change and shift of new replicas being fired up, we still kept a response time that was around half a second. So that just shows you some of the capabilities that you have. And as I mentioned earlier, I have just begun to scratch the surface of what's actually possible when we're working with, when you're actually working with container apps. Now, a couple things I want to point out, and then we're going to open up the entire rest of this for questions. So the first thing I want to show you here is that you can actually get access here to the repository that I actually leveraged for this. So if you want to go through and again, do this yourself, I actually hope that you would do that you would go through and then you can interact with us in the Discord channel specific to Cloud Builder Live. So you can go in and you can ask questions around, hey, I tried this and this isn't working right, or this, this weird step happened here. Feel free, go into Discord, ask those kind of questions. We want you to have these skills. That's the whole reason that this series is around. So with all that said, I'm going to take a quick breath for a moment and I'm going to try to look through and see if there are any questions that we need to actually jump into. Okay, so I see that I kind of did miss, or I didn't fully answer one of Brad's questions. And first of all, I appreciate the compliments there. I think the thing here to note is with Azure load testing, you really configure, so you configure the core resource, then you go in and you configure the specific test that you're running. Could you configure that test to be something that you actually create as a part of a pipeline and specify conditions for? You could. I don't know that that's the way you would usually do it. And again, you might be dealing with some specific use cases that are different than what I'm used to building here. But I think a lot of the thought here is that you have a test with standard conditions that you're going to run as a part of a continuing workflow that's going to be run over and over again. But again, feel free to try it out. You might have experience in this area that I don't, and let us know how it goes. I'd love to know ways that people are using this that are different than, what I envisioned at the beginning. Yes, and I'm going to take another sip of coffee. I don't have water here. I should have that, but coffee will work. Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, I don't see any questions, but I want to do a little bit of a tease. So the next episode is going to be coming up super fast here for Cloud Builder Live. And I mentioned that it's also going to be about Azure. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be helping you. If you haven't yet gotten started with Azure Bicep, no worries. That's what I'm going to be covering. We're going to have a whole episode that's focused on Azure Bicep, how to get your head around it, how to get into it, how to use it, where it's useful, different patterns you can follow. And I hope that's going to be something that's going to be essential for your toolkit, because if you've noticed, this is popping up more and more everywhere you look. So this one's going to be coming up in just a handful of weeks. I'll actually, if you'll follow me on social, so if you either want to follow, again, Pluralsight, a cloud guru, or me, David Tucker, then we'll be posting out the information and the links and all those things as soon as they're available, so you can get access to this. This one, I believe, is the first week of May. We're going to be having this episode. So you'll be able to follow up then and learn all about Azure Bicep. Also, if you have topics that you want us to cover, we want to hear that too. So be sure to shoot out messages to us on social media and say, hey, I want to hear about this. I want to hear about that. We're going to be doing a ton. And like I mentioned, the first 2 episodes were AWS. These 2 are Azure. We are going to be hitting GCP coming up in the near future as well. So we're just excited about where this is going. So let us know what you want us to cover, and we'll make sure that it happens. Okay, cool. Said, love Terraform. Looking forward to the next session. Well, perfect. I'm excited that you're going to be jumping in. I too love infrastructure as code, and I love talking about it because I think there's so many cool things you can do with that. So yeah, hopefully all of you will join me for that episode at the beginning of March, and we'll have fun with that, diving through Azure Bicep. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining me for this episode, for April's episode of Cloud Builder Live. Again, I hope you join me next month. We'll see you then.